I was born in the year 1805, in a village that clung to the curve of the Argolic Gulf like a child clutching its mother's skirt. The sea was the first sound I ever knew, not the gentle lullabies of a mother, but the restless breathing of waves rolling in from far-off places I could not yet imagine. Salt lived in the air. It settled on our lips, on our skin, on the wooden doors of our houses, until they were white-crusted like the old men who fished at dawn. Beyond the low stone walls of our courtyard stood an olive tree older than anyone alive, its roots gripping the earth with the stubbornness of a people who had endured centuries of storms. In its shade, my sisters and I would play, tracing patterns in the dust with sticks, while my mother, her hair wrapped in a faded scarf, sorted lentils on a cloth spread over her lap. Our village smelled of thyme, wood smoke, and fish, always fish. By sunrise, the beach was alive with fishermen pulling their nets, the wet rope biting into their hands. I remember watching my father haul in his catch, his bare feet planted firmly in the sand, the muscles in his back working like ropes drawn taut. He smelled of salt and sun, and when he laughed, it was the sound of someone who belonged entirely to this place. But not everything that belonged to us was truly ours. Above the hill that guarded our bay stood the fortress, its walls pitted with age, its stones scorched by old sieges, and from its highest tower, the flag of the Ottomans fluttered in the wind. A pale green field, the white crescent moon. To a child's eyes, it was just another piece of cloth. To the elders, it was a shadow across the sun. It meant that every loaf of bread, every goat born, every barrel of wine was counted not by us, but by strangers in uniforms that gleamed under the sun. I did not yet understand why my father's eyes hardened when the tax collector came to the village square. I only knew that the air grew heavy on those days. Men spoke in low voices, mothers pulled children close. Even the dogs seemed to slink into corners. The Ottomans did not shout. They did not need to. Their presence alone bent our backs. Still, life went on. Children played in the dust. Women sang while kneading bread. And the bells of the church rang softly, never too loud, lest the wrong ears hear too much joy. I grew up in this balance between beauty and restraint, between the eternal sea and the foreign flag that claimed to rule over it. Looking back now, I realize my earliest memories were shaped not only by the taste of salt and the shade of olive trees, but by the quiet knowledge that we were a people living under someone else's sky. I learned the rules not from a book, but from the way my mother lowered her voice when the soldiers rode past. They came in pairs along the coastal road, boots shining, sabers resting against their hips, as if even the steel were tired of our sun. The horses tossed their heads and left neat, half-moon prints in the dust. No one told us to step aside. We did it anyway. A whole village can learn to move like water around a rock. On market days, the square filled with baskets, figs, olives, rough loaves wrapped in cloth, and with men who watched the fortress more than they watched their bargains. The tax clerk sat beneath a faded awning, his ledger propped on a wooden box. He spoke our language with a dryness that left no room for argument, writing figures with deliberate strokes. My father's coins sounded louder than everyone else's when they fell into the tray. He would nod, sign where the clerk tapped, and walk away without looking back. Later, at home, he would slice a smaller piece of bread for himself, as if appetite were a luxury that might offend someone. The church stood a little off the square, whitewashed and squinting in the sun. Its bell tower was short and cautious, the cross at its top often appearing to bow. On feast days we celebrated softly, the priest's voice never rose. We were careful with how long we let the hymns spill from the doorway, careful with how many candles we lit. Even the smoke seemed to learn restraint, curling into thin, obedient threads. Some rules were written into taxes and permissions. Others clung to the skin. You did not gather in groups of men after dark. You did not carry a knife longer than your palm. You did not teach certain songs to the little ones. My grandmother hummed them anyway, but only when she was shelling beans. head bowed so the tune hid in the small sounds of the work. One afternoon a wedding procession formed, girls in bright scarves, a small drum tapping the heartbeat of the village, the bride's mother crying and laughing at once. We had walked not 50 paces when 2 soldiers reined in at the alley mouth. The drum went quiet in a single breath. The older soldier asked for the paper, the permission, his tone not unkind, only certain. The groom's uncle fumbled in his vest and came up empty. The soldier waited. The bride's mother searched a basket of sweets, as if a document might hide under sugared almonds. In the end, the soldiers nodded toward the square. "Go, ask," the elder said. And the procession turned, colors draining as if someone had tipped the sky and let the light run out. They received the paper before sunset, and the marriage was blessed at night, but the drum never found its loud voice again. It tapped like a thoughtful finger on a table. Later that season, a fishing skiff returned late with a net too full to be believed. The men laughed like boys, salt shining on their shoulders. By morning, the clerk had revised his figures for the whole pier. "If the sea's generous," he said, "we must be generous in return." The men nodded. None of them laughed for a long time after. At home, my mother kept a small chest beneath the bed. Inside, a handful of coins wrapped in cloth, 2 letters from a cousin in the mountains, and a folded icon of the Theotokos, so old the paint had turned to whispers of blue and gold. When the soldiers searched houses rare, but not rare enough, she would move the chest to the smokehouse and cover it with thyme and bay leaves. "Just in case," she'd say, though she never said in case of what. I began to measure time by the seasons, but by inspections, the clerk's visits, the soldiers' rounds, the weeks when the garrison changed and the new men looked at us like a puzzle with missing pieces. I learned the faces of the ones who would accept a cup of water at the well and of the ones who would not meet our eyes. There was one young guard whose moustache was hardly grown. He blushed when my sister thanked him for returning a dropped ribbon. For a moment he looked like a boy we might have known, the kind who would have raced us to the olive grove and scraped his knees. Then he remembered the saber at his side and turned away. We did not hate them the way stories say the ruled must hate. Hate needs a fire, and we were a village trained to bank our flames. We felt something slower and heavier, like carrying a jar that is always a little too full. You grip it carefully, you plan every step. You live your life around not spilling. If there was rebellion in us, it was in the small refusals, the way my father whispered the old heroes' names to me while mending nets, the way my grandmother Essim found its way into my mother's kneading, until the bread itself smelled a little like defiance. Even the olive tree in our yard seemed to lean not toward the fortress, but away from it, as if trees could choose what sky to prefer. I did not yet know the word for the feeling that gathered in my chest on those quiet nights when the sea breathed, and the crickets kept their patient count, and our lamp burned low to save oil. It was not anger. It was not fear. It was the slow, grain by grain weight of understanding. A child learns the shape of his own house by bumping into its furniture. I was learning the shape of our captivity the same way by bruises I could not yet name. The church in our village was not grand, just a squat, whitewashed building crouched at the edge of the square, its dome patched in places where the salt wind had eaten the plaster. Inside, the air was always cool and smelled faintly of beeswax and old incense. I loved it as a boy, not only for the icons that glimmered in the candlelight, but for the way sound seemed to wrap itself in softness, there, as if even our words bowed their heads. On Sundays, my father would place his rough hand on my shoulder and guide me toward the door. We dressed plainly, never in bright colors, not out of humility alone, but out of caution. When the Ottomans walked past the church, we did not want to draw their gaze. Their religion was not ours, and though they allowed us to worship, it was a permission with limits, limits we could feel in the smallness of the bells, in the careful pitch of the priest's voice. I remember one feast day when the congregation swelled beyond the usual number. Relatives from neighboring hamlets had come, bringing gifts of bread and olives, and the hymn for St. Demetrios rose higher than usual, as if the voices themselves forgot to be afraid. I saw Father Jorgo's glance toward the open doorway, his lips still moving in prayer, but his eyes searching for the sound of boots. And then, as if summoned by the thought alone, 2 soldiers appeared outside. They did not enter. They only stood there, watching. The hymn stumbled, caught in the throat of the congregation. The priest's voice lowered. The women folded their hands tighter. By the time the soldiers moved on, the air inside felt thinner, like someone had drawn the joy out of it through a narrow straw. But it was not only in the church where the air shifted under their presence. In the narrow streets, voices learned to curve around certain words. We had a way of speaking in half-thoughts, in gestures and glances, as though language itself might betray us if it was too complete. Men bent close over their coffee cups in the cafeino, their shoulders touching, their whispers barely louder than the clink of a spoon. When a stranger entered, especially one with the posture of authority, conversations would splinter into weather, fishing, the price of olives. Children, of course, have their own form of rebellion. We played at soldiers sometimes, but in our games, the ones in the crescent flag uniforms always lost. Sticks became swords, stones became cannonballs, and the fortress was just the old fig tree by the well. We didn't understand that these games were a kind of daring. Once, a boy named Andreas, whose father was known for his temper, shouted a forbidden song. We marched in play down the lane. His mother appeared in a heartbeat, gripping his arm so tightly her knuckles went white. She told him to go inside, and though she smiled for the sake of anyone watching, her eyes were sharp with fear. Even the market had its language of silence. If you knew where to look, you could tell who had lost a son to a conscription levy. The older men would touch their caps to them without a word. A family that had been fined heavily might sell a prized goat and stand at their stall, as though nothing had happened. But the neighbors would add an extra handful of grain or slip them a bundle of herbs, all without mentioning why. And then there were the nights. Our streets were not well lit, just the occasional oil lamp by a doorway, a faint glow that palled on the stones and left the rest in shadow. After sunset, gatherings were rare, and laughter even rarer. My father would sit by the small hearth, mending his nets or carving a piece of driftwood into something that might one day be a spoon. My mother would sew. My sisters would card wool in the corner. We spoke quietly, because the night carried voices farther than the day, and the walls of a village were not made of stone alone. I used to think the silence of those nights was heavy, because we had nothing to say. I know better now. We had too much to say, to many things that could not be spoken under the shadow of the crescent moon above the fortress. So we let our thoughts live in other places, in the way my mother braided bread, in the way my father taught me knots, in the way my grandmother hummed a hymn that no one outside our house could hear. I was 12 the first time the world around me shrank so suddenly I could feel it pressing against my ribs. It was late spring, the air already warm, the fields full of the hum of bees. My father had sent me to the far end of the village with a bundle of mended nets for a fisherman named Stavros. The nets were rough against my shoulder, smelling of tar and salt, and the sun sat high enough to paint the stones in sharp, white light. As I crossed the square, I saw a small crowd gathered near the well. Not the relaxed knot of gossiping villagers, but the tighter circle of people standing, because they did not wish to sit. At the center, 2 Ottoman soldiers were speaking to a man I knew, Petros, the schoolteacher. He was young for the role, with an easy smile and a way of telling stories that made even the smallest boy sit still. I had spent many afternoons under the shade of the plane tree, listening to him speak of Homer's heroes and the battles of long ago, his voice carrying the kind of pride that made you feel taller just hearing it. The soldiers held a thin leather-bound book. I recognized it. Petros had read from it the day before, tracing the words with his finger as if they were sacred. Now the older soldier was turning the pages slowly, his lips curling at the corners in a way I could not read. Petros stood straight, his hands clasped behind his back. He looked calm, but there was a tightness in his jaw I had never seen before. They spoke too quietly for me to hear the words, but I caught fragments, something about permission, something about the old language, and then, without warning, the younger soldier stepped forward, took the book from his companion, and dropped it into the dust. A boot came down on its spine. The sound was dull, like a loaf of bread crushed under a hand. When he lifted his foot, the pages were bent and dirty. No one moved, not even Petros. He only bent to pick it up, brushing at the dirt with fingers that shook once, then stilled. The soldiers left, their boots clapping against the stones. The crowd slowly unwound itself, spilling back into the square as if nothing had happened. But I noticed something. People were looking at each other less, their eyes fixed on the ground. Petros saw me lingering and called me over. He handed me the book. "Take this to your father," he said. "Tell him to keep it safe." I nodded, clutching it to my chest, feeling the rough edge where the leather had split. It was heavier than I expected, not in weight, but in the way it seemed to pull the air around it tighter. That night, my father sat by the hearth turning the book in his hands. He didn't open it. He just ran his thumb along the spine, the way a man might trace the scar of an old wound. "These words," he said finally, "are ours. Even if they take the paper, the ink, the voice that speaks them, the words are still ours." He looked at me then, his eyes steady. "You must remember them, all of them. So no one can burn them." I lay awake for a long time after the lamp was put out, listening to the slow breathing of my family, the whisper of the sea beyond the walls. For the first time, I understood that the fortress on the hill was not the only thing keeping us bound. There were walls made of silence and fear, and they could be carried inside you wherever you went. That was the day I began to notice the way the sky looked smaller when the soldiers rode through the village. And once you notice that, it never looks wide again. It began, as so many storms do, with a whisper. I was 16 that spring, already taller than my father, my hands calloused from hauling nets and cutting rope. The sea had been generous that year, but the village was restless in a way I couldn't yet name. The air seemed to carry more than just the scent of thyme and salt. It carried words, low and urgent, that slipped between conversations like fish darting through reeds. The first I heard of it was from a trader named Leonidas, who came down from the mountains with mules laden with wool and chestnuts. He stopped at our cafeteria for coffee, and the men gathered close, their chairs scraping the stone. I lingered outside the doorway, pretending to examine a basket of figs, straining to catch the edge of his voice. "Filiki Tyria," he said, barely above a murmur, as though the name itself was contraband. "They meet in secret, in the north, in Odessa, in Patros. Greeks, brothers to us, sworn to free the land." A few heads nodded. One man crossed himself. Another glanced toward the street to make sure no uniform passed by. Leonidas leaned in. "They say it will be soon. The Turks are distracted in the east, wars of their own." This is the moment. I had heard the word freedom before, of course, in church sermons, in my father's quiet stories about the days before the crescent flag. But here, in the trader's voice, it was not an idea from the past. It was something alive, something that could move through villages and over mountains like a hidden river. That evening I asked my father about it, while we mended nets in the fading light. He worked in silence for a time, the twine rasping against his palm. "Finally," he said, "rumors are like sparks, Nikolas, they can warm you. Or burn down the whole house." He tied the knot with a sharp pull. "Do not speak of this again, not outside these walls. But once you hear a spark hiss, you cannot pretend it's not there." I began to notice things I had overlooked. Men meeting in barns late at night, a traveling priest carrying not only his icons, but also a rolled-up map under his cassock. Fishermen returning from the far islands with more than just fish in their boats. When they thought no one was looking, they would pass small bundles wrapped in oilcloth, to heavy 4 letters, to light 4 food. One afternoon, as I walked home from the shore, I saw my father speaking to a man I didn't recognize. They stood close, heads bent together. The stranger had the look of a sailor, his coat worn, his hands rough. When he noticed me, he nodded politely, but without warmth. My father sent me inside with a flick of his hand. Through the open window, I caught only one word, before the wind swallowed it: soon. It was as if the village was holding its breath, waiting for something that had not yet shown itself. Life went on. Nets were mended, bread was baked, prayers were whispered. But beneath it all, there was a new rhythm, like the deep hum of a drum far away. You couldn't hear it clearly yet, but you could feel it in your bones. I didn't know it then, but the spark had already touched dry grass. It started with the sound of doors closing too quietly. At first, I thought it was only my imagination, the creak of a latch in the hour when even the crickets had grown tired, but soon it became a pattern. A faint scuff of boots on the stone, a shadow sliding past the window, the whisper of voices that did not carry the ease of conversation, but the urgency of a farewell. The first to go was Andreas, the blacksmith's eldest son. His absence was noticed the next morning when the forge stayed cold. His mother told the neighbors he had gone to work in Nafplio, but her eyes were swollen and her voice brittle, as though each word had been set carefully in place so it wouldn't break. A week later, Yorgos the cooper vanished in the same way, leaving behind half-finished barrels and the smell of resin still sharp in his workshop. I began to watch the village at night. Our house stood near the narrow road that led to the hills, where the olive groves gave way to rougher paths. On more than one occasion, I saw figures moving toward that darkness, their shapes barely more than smudges in the moonlight. Some walked alone, others in pairs. They carried no torches, only small bundles slung across their shoulders. One night, unable to help myself, I slipped from my bed and followed at a distance. My bare feet found the cool edges of the path, the stones pressing into my soreness. The men ahead of me did not speak, but their movements were sure, as though they had walked this way many times. At the edge of the grove, they met another figure, a man with a cloak drawn tight, a musket slung over his back. He nodded once, and together they vanished into the black of the hills. The next day, I asked my father if he knew where they had gone. He didn't look up from his work, only said, "To where men either come back as heroes or don't come back at all." I wanted to ask more, but there was something in his voice, a hardness wrapped around sorrow, that told me to stop. The disappearances continued. In the evenings, women lingered in their doorways long after the sun went down, eyes fixed on the road as if willing their husbands or sons to reappear. By day, they worked twice as hard, shouldering the tasks left behind, speaking little. Children became quieter too, sensing something had shifted, though no one explained what. And then, one night, the quiet broke. It was nearly dawn when I heard hurried footsteps in the lane, heavier than those careful midnight departures. I opened the shutter to see my father in the road, speaking to my mother in quick, clipped words. She gripped his forearm, her knuckles white. He kissed her cheek once, not the lingering way he did when leaving for the sea, but as if time itself were pushing him forward. When he stepped inside to wake me, I already knew. "I have to go, Nikolas," he said. His eyes were steady, but there was a weight in them I had never seen. "Look after them. Be the man of the house now." I wanted to speak, to ask where, to say no, to beg him to stay, but my throat closed. I only nodded. By the time the sun broke over the horizon, he was gone, swallowed by the same hills that had taken the others. That day, the forge remained cold, the barrels unfinished, and our nets lay in the corner, unmended. The village was quieter than I had ever known it, and for the first time in my life, the sound of the sea felt too far away to comfort me. It happened in the hour when the sun is just beginning to slide toward the horizon, when the shadows stretch long and the light turns the walls of the village the color of old honey. I was mending a tear in one of our smaller nets near the doorway, my mother kneading bread in the kitchen, my youngest sister humming some tune she had no business knowing, one of the old songs my grandmother had taught her in whispers. The first sighing was not the sound of horses, but the silence of birds. One moment they were chattering in the olive grove, the next they were gone, as if a giant hand had swept them from the air. Then came the distant clatter, hooves on stone, steady and purposeful. My mother looked up from her work. "Inside," she said, not sharply, but with a firmness that brooked no delay. I gathered my sister and stepped back into the dimness of the house, peering through the narrow slit of the shutters. They came in a line, a dozen Ottoman soldiers, their coats dark against the fading light, muskets slung across their backs. At their head rode a man I had seen before, an officer, broad-shouldered, his black beard streaked with grey. His eyes swept the village the way a butcher might look over his animals before choosing which to slaughter. They dismounted in the square. The officer barked an order I couldn't make out, but its effect was immediate. Half the men began kicking indoors, pulling people into the open. The others moved toward the forge, the cafino, the storehouses. And then, from somewhere near the edge of the village, came a sound that froze my blood, the crack of a musket. Not the sharp pop of a hunting shot, but the deeper, angrier sound of a weapon fired at a man. Shouts erupted, both in Greek and Turkish. The soldiers wheeled, scanning the rooftops. Another shot rang out, and one of them fell, his musket clattering on the stones. That was when the officer gave the order. Flames do not roar immediately, they whisper first, the way drywood catches, and then begins to breathe. But within minutes, smoke coiled upward from the cooper's shop, then from the forge, then from a house near the well. The air thickened with the smell of burning resin, straw, and something worse, the sharp, cloying scent of cloth and oil catching at once. My mother pulled us toward the back door, to the grove, she said. We slipped into the alley, our footsteps swallowed by the crackle behind us. I kept glancing back, the orange glow growing brighter, licking at the sky. In the square, I saw the officer drag a man to his knees, Yorgos, the cooper, and press a blade to his throat. I never heard what was said. My mother's hand on my shoulder turned me away. We ran. Through the narrow path between houses, past the last low wall, into the olive grove, where the ground turned uneven, and the air smelled of earth instead of smoke. Others were already there. Women clutching children, old men bent double with exhaustion. Somewhere farther up the hill, a musket cracked again, and the cry that followed was short and final. From the safety of the trees, I watched the village's heart turn red and black. The fortress flag still hung in the distance, unmoved, indifferent. That night, the grove became our home. The bread my mother had been kneading lay half-risen on the kitchen table, abandoned. The nets I'd mended were folded neatly by the door, waiting for a sea we might never return to. I lay awake listening to the murmurs of the displaced, the coughing of children, and the quiet sobs of those who had lost someone in the chaos. The sky above was vast and full of stars, but it felt like a sky for another people, in another time. It was the night I learned that a village is not just a place, it is a body, and when its heart is burned, every soul within it carries the scar. By morning, the grove smelled of cold ashes and unwashed bodies. The smoke from the village still hung in the air, a grey veil between us and the rising sun. We had no fire, not for warmth, not for cooking. No one dared draw attention with the smell of smoke so soon after the night before. We ate olives from a single jar passed around in silence, the salt brine stinging our cracked lips. I wandered to the edge of the grove, where the trees thinned and the hillside offered a view of the valley below. What I saw made me stop mid-step. Across the fields, beyond the far road, where the hills began to fold into one another, a group of men was gathered. They were not Ottoman soldiers. Their clothes were mismatched, their boots dusty, their weapons a patchwork of muskets and curved blades. But it was what they held above them that rooted me to the ground, a banner, white and blue, the colours shifting in the wind. It was the first time I had seen the Greek flag in my life. It looked smaller than I'd imagined, hand-stitched, the edges fraying. And yet it burned brighter in my eyes than the flames that had consumed our homes. The white was not the soft color of linen. It was the glare of sunlight on salt water. The blue was not the gentle shade of a painted door, but the deep, certain hue of the Aegean when the wind rises. Someone came to stand beside me. Leonidas, the mountain trader who had first spoken of the Philikiteria in the Caphenia weeks before. His eyes followed mine. "They've taken Kranadi," he said quietly. "Drove the Turks out last night. Word is spreading. Villages are joining them, one by one." I stared at the flag, watching it snap in the wind, and something shifted in my chest, not the slow weight I'd carried 4 years under Ottoman rule, but a sharper thing, a pull. For the first time, I could picture a life not bent around silence and permission, but Leonidas's voice darkened. "That flag will draw them like a wound draws flies. The Turks will come, and they'll come hard. Tell your mother to be ready to move." I nodded, though I didn't want to move at all. I wanted to run toward the men, to touch that cloth, to feel for myself the texture of a dream made solid. But I stayed where I was, because I knew that for every flag that rose, 100 swords would follow. By midday, the men in the distance began to march, their banner leading them into the hills. I watched until they vanished between the ridges, until only the empty valley remained. Yet even after they were gone, I could still see that blue and white in my mind, a defiant stroke of color against all the gray I had ever known. That night, lying under the olive trees with the cold settling into my bones, I realized the war had already begun. It was no longer a matter of whispers or rumors. The hills around us were waking, and their voices were sharp with the promise and the cost of freedom. The morning we left, the sea was calm, the kind of calm that feels wrong, as if it knows more than it is willing to say. Its surface lay smooth as hammered metal, catching the pale light of dawn, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it for long. Every wave seemed like a reminder of what we were walking away from, the nets drying by the door, the boat my father had built plank by plank, the smell of salt that had been stitched into my childhood. We set out in a thin line, moving through the olive grove toward the hills. My mother carried a bundle on her back, tied with strips of cloth cut from our bedsheets. My sisters each held a small sack, one filled with bread, the other with a few cooking pots nested together like shells. I carried the heaviest load, the jar of olives, a blanket, and the book Petros had given me months before, wrapped in linen to keep the dust away. We were not alone. Other families had gathered in the grove during the night, and now we all walked together, bound by the same unspoken truth. The village was gone, and there was nothing to return to. The air was full of the soft shuffling of feet, the clink of metal pots, the occasional cough. No one spoke unless they had to. The road that led inland twisted upward between low hills. From the crest of the first rise, I looked back and saw the faint smear of smoke still hanging over the place where I had lived all my life. Even from here, I could make out the shape of the fortress, its flag still unbothered, as if the fires at its feet were beneath its notice. At midday, we stopped in a patch of shade by a stream. People knelt to drink, splashing their faces, filling whatever jars or skins they carried. My mother gave each of us a piece of bread, rationing it with the same care she might give a blessing. The crust was hard, but I chewed slowly, knowing there might be no more for some time. It was then that I noticed the first wounded man. He came down the path from the north, leaning on a musket like a crutch. His left arm hung limp, his shirt dark with dried blood. A woman hurried to him with a cloth and water, but he waved her away, saying something about needing to find his unit. He passed us without stopping, his eyes fixed somewhere far ahead. We saw more after that, men with makeshift bandages, women with torn skirts carrying children whose faces were streaked with soot. They spoke of fighting near Kranadi, of skirmishes in the hills, of villages changing hands twice in a single week. Each story was different, but they all ended the same way. There was no safe place to go, only safer ones, and even those might not stay that way for long. That night, we camped in a shallow valley, the ground soft with fallen leaves. The stars were bright, but I could not enjoy them. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the black smoke curling above my home, the blue and white flag in the distance, and my father walking into the hills without looking back. I told myself we were only passing through, that one day we would find a place where the sea met the shore the way it did at home, and we would build again. But even then, I think a part of me knew the truth. Once you turn your back on the water that raised you, you never truly return to it. By the third day, the bread was gone. We still had the jar of olives, but my mother rationed them so strictly that each one felt like a coin dropped into an empty hand, precious, fleeting. We drank from streams we found along the way, cupping the water in our palms. It was cold and clear in the hills, but it could not quiet the hollow gnawing in our bellies. The road had changed. At first, it had been a narrow ribbon of earth threading between olive groves and low fields. Now it was a scar of trampled dust, lined with footprints and wheel ruts, scattered with things people had dropped or abandoned, a broken sandal, a cracked clay pot, a child's carved wooden horse with one ear missing. I picked it up and carried it for a while before setting it on a stone by the path, hoping the owner might see it if they came back this way. The stream of people moving with us had thinned, but the ones who remained were harder, quieter. Some walked alone, eyes fixed ahead, carrying nothing at all. Others moved in small groups, bound together less by family than by necessity. You learned to judge them quickly, which faces would share their fire, which ones would push you aside for a place to sleep. On the fourth morning, we came upon a cart broken in the road. Its axle had snapped clean through, the load of sacks spilling into the dust. The man kneeling beside it was grey-bearded, his hands shaking as he tried to lift the weight on his own. My mother went to him, my sisters following, but before she could help, two men we didn't know stepped in. They took the top sacks without a word, slinging them over their shoulders, and walked off as if the old man were invisible. He didn't shout or chase them, he just sat back in the dust and closed his eyes. That night, we shared our last handful of olives with him. He told us his name was Pavlos, that he'd been a miller in a village near Argos before the soldiers came. They took the stones from my mill, he said, staring into the dark. Do you know what that means? They didn't just want the grain. They wanted to make sure we couldn't feed ourselves again. The road was teaching me things I hadn't learned in the village, how quickly people could be stripped down to what they truly were, how kindness could survive in some and vanish in others, and how hunger could make you forget the difference. On the fifth day, we passed a boy no older than 10, sitting by the roadside with a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. His eyes were wide and glassy. I stopped, crouched in front of him, and asked where his family was. He didn't answer. My mother put a piece of bread in his hand, the last scrap we had saved for the morning, and told him to keep walking with us. But after a mile, when I looked back, he was gone. I didn't mention it to my sisters. There were some silences better kept. That night, as we huddled together under the thin blanket, the wind carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere ahead, I realized the war was not just in the battles or the burning villages. It was in the slow, grinding theft of everything that made a place feel like home, food, warmth, trust, and it was still only beginning. By the sixth day, our path wound into a shallow valley where the hills folded in on themselves, hiding a cluster of low fires. At first, I thought we had stumbled upon another village, but as we drew closer, I saw the truth. This was not a place anyone had been born into. It was a camp, thrown together from canvas scraps, wagon frames, and walls of piled stones no taller than a man's chest. The smell reached us before the voices did, smoke, boiled grain, and the sharp tang of too many people living too close. Dogs skulked at the edges, ribs showing through their fur, their eyes bright with hunger. Children darted between the tents, some barefoot, some wearing shirts too large for them, sleeves dragging in the dirt. A man with a cloth wrapped over half his face stopped us near the edge. He carried a long knife at his belt, but he asked no questions beyond, "How many?" My mother answered, "3 children, 1 adult," he nodded, then motioned toward the far end of the camp where a strip of ground lay clear. "You can take space there. Fire's low. Water is from the spring to the east." We staked our place with nothing more than our blanket and a few stones to keep the wind from stealing it. The ground was uneven, dotted with thistles, but it was ours for the night. As evening fell, I wandered toward the center of the camp, where the largest fire burned. Men sat there in a ring, their faces drawn and shadowed by the flames. They spoke of the war the way fishermen spoke of the sea, with a mix of awe, fear, and the certainty that it could never truly be tamed. I listened as one man told of a skirmish near Tripolitsa, where the rebels had ambushed an Ottoman supply train. "We took the grain, the powder, the horses," he said, his voice low. "But the Turks will take it back tenfold. They always do." Another man swore that the Russians were coming, that ships had been sighted off the coast. A third shook his head. "No one is coming," he muttered. "We are on our own." Behind them, women moved between the tents, tending to the wounded. Some injuries were old, scars twisted across skin like melted wax. Others were fresh, the bandages still wet with blood. A boy not much older than me sat on a stool, while a woman stitched the side of his face. He didn't flinch, not even when the needle tugged at the skin. Near the fire, I spotted Leonidas, the mountain trader. He was speaking quietly to a man whose coat was torn at the shoulder, revealing a bandolier of powder cartridges. They bent their heads close, and though I couldn't hear the words, I saw the quick glances they cast toward the hills. When Leonidas noticed me watching, he beckoned me over. "Nikolas," he said, "this is Kostas. He's been fighting since the first shots in the north." Kostas's gaze was sharp, measuring. "You've got strong legs," he said, as if the rest of me didn't matter. "You can carry messages." I nodded, not fully understanding what I was agreeing to. "Good. We may need you." That night, back at our small patch of ground, I lay awake listening to the camp breathe, the murmur of voices, the cough of the sick, the clink of a musket being checked in the dark. Somewhere far off, a dog barked, and the sound carried through the valley like a warning. For the first time, I felt the war not as a distant storm, but as a living thing, pressing close, its breath warm on the back of my neck. And I knew it was only a matter of time before it called my name. It was Leonidas who woke me, shaking my shoulder before the light had touched the hills. The camp was still wrapped in the blue-grey of pre-dawn, most fires long since died to embers. My mother stirred, but said nothing, only pulled my youngest sister closer, as if she knew whatever I was about to do would take me farther from her than the distance alone could measure. Leonidas crouched beside me, his voice low. "You'll take something to Castro village. Half a day north, through the ravine. Stay on the goat tracks. The main road is crawling with patrols." He handed me a small leather pouch, no larger than my palm. It was sealed with wax, the imprint of a cross pressed deep into the surface. "Don't open it," he said. "Don't even think about what's inside. If you're caught, drop it. Better it's lost than taken." I nodded, slipping the pouch inside my shirt where it rested warm against my chest. My hands felt steady, though my stomach had the same hollow twist it used to get before storms at sea. By the time I left the camp, the sun was lifting over the ridge, washing the olive leaves in gold. The first mile was easy, the ground firm and dry. Birds called from the trees, and for a moment I could almost pretend I was just a boy on an errand between villages, as I'd done 100 times before. But the ravine was another world. The air there was cooler, damp with the smell of stone and water. My footsteps echoed, and I forced myself to slow down, to listen between each one. Twice I heard voices ahead and crouched low behind boulders until they passed. Men in Ottoman uniforms, muskets slung casually, their laughter bouncing off the rock walls. At one point, I came upon the remains of a fire. The ashes were still warm. Beside it lay a broken clay flask and the gnawed bones of a goat, stripped clean. I moved more carefully after that, keeping to the shadows where the sun did not reach. By midday, I climbed out of the ravine and onto the higher paths that wound through the scrub hills. From there, I could see the whitewashed walls of Castro village in the distance, clustered like sheep on the slope. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, not the black, choking kind I feared, but the thin, pale threads of cooking fires. I was halfway down the slope when I saw the riders. 3 of them, their coats marked with the crescent, moving at a trot along the path below me. I dropped flat among the rocks, the scrub scratching my arms, and waited until the sound of hoofs faded. Only then did I rise, my knees stiff, my heart thudding like a drum in my ears. Castro was quieter than I expected. The people there looked at me with the cautious eyes of those who had seen strangers bring both trouble and hope. I asked for the name Leonidas had given me, Dimitri, and was led to a house near the edge of the village. Dimitri was an older man, his beard streaked with white, his clothes smelling faintly of gunpowder. I handed him the pouch. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he studied me for a long moment before asking, "Did anyone see you?" "No," I said. He broke the seal, scanned the contents quickly, then burned the paper over a lamp until nothing but curling black ash remained. Only then did he smile. "You did well, boy. Better than some grown men I've known." I stayed long enough to drink a cup of water, then began the walk back. The sun was dipping low, throwing long shadows ahead of me. I moved faster this time, driven by the pull of the camp, of the familiar voices, and the thin blanket waiting in the dark. When I returned, Leonidas clapped a hand on my shoulder. "You're first," he said. "There will be others." I lay awake that night, the smell of smoke and dust still in my nose, thinking of the way Dimitri had burned the paper. Whatever was written there had been important enough to risk the ravine, the patrols, the silence between my mother's eyes when she saw me go. And though no one had said it aloud, I knew I had just taken my first real step into the war. It was early evening when the news reached us. The camp was settling into its usual rhythm, small fires sparking to life, pots simmering over low flames, the quiet hum of voices woven with the occasional cough. I was repairing a strap on one of our water skins when a shout cut through the air. It wasn't the sharp cry of warning we had learned to fear, but something else, urgent, yes, but laced with a kind of disbelief. A man came striding down the slope toward the camp, his hair wine-tossed, his coat dusted white from the chalky hills. His eyes swept over us until they found Leonidas, and he spoke in a voice that carried to every ear. "Tripolitsa has fallen." At first, no one moved. The name hung in the air like the pause before a thunderclap. Tripolitsa, the Ottoman stronghold in the Peloponnese, the heart of their power in the south. A place we had all heard of, but never imagined in Greek hands. The man went on, words tumbling over themselves. The rebels had surrounded the city for months, cutting off supplies, tightening the noose. The final assault had been swift and brutal. The gates were breached, the garrison overwhelmed, the crescent flag torn down. In its place, blue and white rising over the walls. Around me, faces shifted as the meaning sank in. A boy of maybe 15 let out a cheer that was quickly echoed by others. Some of the older men laughed, a short, almost unbelieving sound. My mother closed her eyes and whispered a prayer. Even the wounded sat a little straighter, as if the news itself could knit their bones, but not everyone smiled. I saw Kostas, the fighter I had met at the campfire days earlier, standing with his arms crossed. His expression was hard, his gaze fixed not on the messenger, but on the hills beyond. When he caught me looking, he shook his head. "This will bring them," he said quietly, "every soldier they can spare. They will come like a flood." That night, the camp felt different. The fires burned brighter, the voices rose higher. Some men began planning aloud, where the rebels might strike next, how far the tide could turn. Others argued whether it was safer to stay in the camp or move deeper into the mountains before the Ottoman retaliation arrived. Leonidas found me near our tent. "Do you understand what this means, Nikolas?" he asked. I thought I did. It meant hope. It meant the war was no longer just scattered flames, but a fire too big to stamp out. It meant my father, wherever he was, might be fighting on ground we now called ours. But in Leonidas's eyes, I saw something more complicated. Pride, yes, but also the tightness of a man measuring time before the storm. As I lay down that night, the camp still buzzing with talk, I pictured Tripolitzy's walls, the flag rising against the autumn sky. I imagined the cheer of the rebels as the gates fell, the pounding of feet on cobblestone, the echo of musket fire fading into a new kind of silence. And though I could not see it, I could feel it, the first real breath of a nation struggling to be born. Kostas's warning settled into the camp like the first chill of autumn, subtle at first, but impossible to ignore. By morning, the air felt taut, as though the hills themselves were bracing. The changes began quietly. Men who had been content to keep their muskets wrapped in cloth now sat by the fires, oiling the barrels and checking the flints. Those with no weapons sharpened farm tools, sickles, pruning hooks, even long kitchen knives, until the metal caught the light. Women began boiling what little grain we had into thick, salted paste, rolling it into small hard cakes that could be carried 4 days without spoiling. Leonidas was everywhere at once, speaking to fighters, mapping routes in the dust, sending boys to scout the paths down from the low passes. I saw him at one point with Kostas. The two men bent over a scrap of parchment marked with hurried lines and circles. Their voices were low, but their gestures sharp, to men trying to fit too many dangers into too little time. By midday, the decision was made. The camp would split. Those too young, too old, or too wounded would be moved deeper into the mountains toward a hidden valley Leonidas swore was safe. The rest, the fighters, and those willing to become fighters, would stay near the edge of the hills to slow whatever force the Ottomans sent. I knew what that meant for me before anyone said it. When Leonidas found me, I was with my mother, helping her wrap what little we owned into 2 bundles, one for her and my sisters, one for me. She looked at him without speaking, her hands tightening on the cloth. "He's quick on his feet," Leonidas said to her, "knows the ravines. We'll need runners if the lines break." My mother's jaw worked, but she didn't raise her voice. "And if they catch him?" she asked. Leonidas didn't answer. I expected her to refuse, to tell him I would go with her to the hidden valley, away from the danger. Instead, she tied the bundle tighter and handed it to me. Her eyes were steady, though her voice was soft. "If you go, you run fast. You don't play the hero. You come back to me." That night, as the sun bled into the horizon, those staying behind gathered on the edge of the camp. Kostas spoke to us, not with the fire of a leader rallying troops, but with the plain, hard truth of a man who had seen enough battles to know what they cost. "They'll come in numbers," he said. "We're not here to win a war today. We're here to give the others time to vanish. Hold your ground as long as you can, then fall back. And if you re-carrying a message," his eyes met mine, "you deliver it or you die trying." The air was still when he finished. No cheering, no bravado. Just the quiet acceptance of those who knew they were stepping into the teeth of something bigger than themselves. As darkness settled, I lay on the thin blanket beside my bundle, listening to the muted rustle of people leaving, the part of the camp that would be gone by morning. I didn't sleep much. Every creak of leather, every soft thud of a boot reminded me that by this time tomorrow, I would no longer just be watching the war from its edges. I would be standing in its path. The first sign was the dust. It rose on the horizon like a second dawn, long before we heard the hooves. At first it was faint, a smear against the pale morning sky, but Kostas saw it and knew. He didn't shout an order. He just said, "They're coming," and every man within earshot moved as if pulled by an unseen rope. I was standing with Leonidas near the edge of the ridge, From there we could see the low road winding out of the plain, a pale ribbon between the scattered scrub. The dust cloud grew darker, heavier, until it swallowed the horizon. Then the sound came, the distant roll of hooves and wheels, deep enough to be felt in the ribs. They brought cannon, Leonidas muttered. We had no cannons. We had muskets, a few pistols, and more blades than bullets, but we had the hills, and coasters meant to make the most of them. The fighters spread along the ridge, each man finding his cover among the rocks and low brush. I was placed halfway between two older men, my task not to fire, but to run messages if the line shifted. My musket lay beside me anyway, the weight of it both a comfort and a promise I wasn't sure I wanted to keep. When the Ottomans appeared, they seemed to pour into the road all at once, cavalry at the front, the sun flashing on their sabres, infantry in close columns behind, and, farther back, the lumbering shapes of cannons, drawn by teams of sweating horses. Their officers rode ahead, scanning the hills. The first shot cracked from our left flank, sharp and clean. A rider pitched forward off his horse, then another shot, and another, until the ridge erupted in smoke and sound. The Ottomans answered with musket fire, the balls hissing through the scrub, chipping stone. Leonidas gripped my arm. 2 coasters, he said. Tell him the left is holding, but the center is moving up. I ran low along the ridge, boots slipping in the loose rock, my breath loud in my ears. Men crouched behind cover shouted to each other, reloading, firing, ducking as lead tore through the air. When I reached coasters, he was leaning out from behind a boulder, shouting directions. Tell the center to fall back to the second rise. He barked without looking at me. Draw them in, then hit them from the flanks. I sprinted back, heart hammering, lungs burning. Bullets snapped past like angry bees. Once, a musket ball struck the stone beside me and sprayed my cheek with grit. I delivered the message, and the men began pulling back in controlled bursts, to firing, while the others retreated a few paces, then switching. From the ridge, I saw the Ottomans climbing, their boots slipping on the scree. We gave ground slowly, making them pay for every step. But their numbers kept coming, a tide that could not be turned by rocks and courage alone. Then the cannon spoke. The first blast tore through the ridge to my right, sending stone and dirt into the air. The sound rolled through the hills like a breaking storm, and for a moment the air itself seemed to shake. Fall back, Leonidas shouted. To the narrow pass, the retreat became a scramble. Men slung their muskets over their shoulders, grabbing powder horns and pouches as they ran. The Ottomans pressed harder, their shouts growing louder. I stayed near Leonidas, my legs aching as we climbed toward the pass that would take us deeper into the hills. When we reached it, Kostas was already there, his face streaked with sweat and powder. He held the last of the fighters in place, just long enough for the rest of us to slip through. By the time the Ottomans crested the ridge, we were gone, swallowed by the narrow, twisting path. The fight had lasted less than an hour. We had slowed them, blooded them, but they would be back, and as we stumbled deeper into the hills, the smoke of our gunfire clinging to our clothes, I realized something I hadn't before. There was no safe place to retreat to anymore. From now on, the war would follow us wherever we went. We did not stop running until the sound of hooves was swallowed by the mountains. The pass wound like a serpent between cliffs, the air cool and damp, smelling faintly of moss. Every step echoed, and the echoes reminded me that we were too close together, too easy to trap if the enemy found another way through. Kostas led us, his musket slung, but his eyes sharp, scanning every bend. Leonidas followed close behind, carrying a pouch of powder, as though it were worth more than gold. I brought up the middle, my legs trembling with the kind of fatigue that no amount of wool can hide. We emerged into a hollow, a wide, hidden bowl of earth surrounded by steep slopes, invisible unless you were standing in it. It was the kind of place shepherds might use in summer, a secret kept between man and mountain. Kostas stopped in the center and finally allowed himself to breathe. "This will do for tonight," he said. "We need water and a fire, small fires." No smoke. The men scattered, some to gather wood, others to search for the trickle of a spring. I sank onto a flat rock, my chest still heaving. My hands stank of powder, and when I wiped them on my trousers, they left black smears. By dusk, the fires were burning low, their light flickering over faces that looked older than they had that morning. We had lost 3 men in the retreat. No one spoke their names aloud, but I saw their absence in the way the others sat, the gaps in the circle, the glances toward the path we had come from. Leonidas crouched beside me and handed me a strip of dried meat. "Eat," he said. "You'll need your strength." I chewed slowly, the taste of salt and smoke filling my mouth. "Will they follow us here?" I asked. "Not tonight," he said, though he didn't sound certain. "They've had their victory for the day." Kostas joined us then, squatting on his heels. "We can't keep running," he said flatly. "Every step back gives them more ground, more villages to burn. We need to strike when they don't expect it." Leonidas frowned. "With what?" "We're short on powder. Half our muskets are fouled, and the men are hungry. You'd be sending them to die. Better let them watch the rest of the country burn while we hide in the rocks," Kostas snapped. His voice carried, and a few heads turned toward us. I sat silent between them, the strip of meat growing heavier in my hand. Part of me understood Kostas, the need to push back, to show the enemy we were still there. But Leonidas's caution felt just as true. I had seen the numbers in the valley, the glint of sunlight on their cannon. That night, as the fires dwindled to embers, I lay on the hard ground, listening to their low voices carry into the dark. They spoke of supply lines, of striking at small garrisons, of moving north to link with other bands. Every plan seemed to end the same way, with risk, with blood, with the uncertain hope that enough small blows might add up to something greater. Sleep came slowly. In my dreams the blue and white flag snapped in the wind above a burning city, and below it a path stretched out before me, one leading deeper into the mountains, the other straight back into the teeth of the enemy. By morning, I knew that sooner or later I would have to choose which one to walk. It was 2 years before I saw Athens for the first time. By then, the war's smoke had thinned, though it still clung to certain valleys and to the memories of those who had fought. Villages were rebuilding in uneven patches, a new roof here, a repaired well there, while other places still lay in ruin, their stones blackened, their streets silent. But the word independence was no longer whispered like a dangerous prayer. It was spoken aloud now, in marketplaces, in the open air, in the proud voices of men who had traded muskets for plows. Leonidas had told me, "If you want to understand what we've fought for, go to Athens," and so I went, walking the last mile from the dusty road until the city rose before me. I had imagined something ancient, marble columns, temples that glowed in the sun, the voices of philosophers echoing from the stones. And those things were there. In a way, the Acropolis stood high and bright, its white pillars catching the light like the bones of a giant. But around it sprawled a city in the making, part ruin, part promise. Streets were being cleared of rubble, new houses rising where old ones had been burned. The sound of hammers and saws filled the air alongside the calls of merchants and the rumble of wagon wheels. I passed a group of soldiers in crisp new uniforms, their boots polished, their muskets gleaming. They stood straighter than the fighters I had known in the hills, and their commands were shouted in German. It startled me until I remembered what Leonidas had said. Our new king, Otto, was a Bavarian prince. Athens now held not just Greeks, but foreign officers, engineers, and architects sent to shape the capital into something worthy of a modern nation. In the square, I saw people selling figs, olives, woven cloth, and small clay pots painted in the old style. Children ran between the stalls, their laughter high and unguarded, a sound I hadn't heard in years, without flinching. An old man played a lyra, and his song carried a bittersweet edge, as if reminding everyone that joy and loss were now bound together in this new Greece. But not all faces were smiling. On the steps of a half-built government hall, a group of men argued fiercely. One, his coat frayed at the edges, jabbed his finger toward the soldiers across the square. "We fought to be ruled by our own," I heard him say, "not to bow to a king from across the sea." His companions murmured their agreement, their eyes darting to see who might be listening. I stayed in the city until the sun began to dip, walking its streets, listening to its noise, breathing in the mingled scents of fresh-cut timber and roasting chestnuts. Athens felt alive in a way no place I had seen since the war began, alive and restless, like a man who had been chained 4 years, and now paced the room, testing the strength of his own legs. As I left that evening, I glanced back once more at the Acropolis, glowing in the last light. For all the noise and dust, for all the foreign uniforms and half-finished walls, there was something unshakable in the way it stood, as if to remind anyone who looked that Greece had been here long before us, and would remain long after. I stayed in Athens for several days, long enough for the city's rhythms to seep into me. By the second morning, I knew which streets were choked with carts before the sun was high, and which alleyways carried the smell of baking bread from their ovens. I learned to time my walks to avoid the worst of the midday dust that hung in the air like a veil, but the longer I remained, the more I began to feel the seam between two worlds. The Greece I had known in the villages, and the one King Otto seemed intent on building here. The foreign presence was everywhere. In the mornings, I passed lines of Bavarian soldiers drilling in the open fields, their bright blue uniforms a sharp contrast to the patched trousers and homespun coats of the local militia. German and French mixed with Greek in the air, engineers barking orders over the construction of a new road, merchants shouting in several tongues at once. The king's advisors moved through the streets with the air of men measuring a space they intended to redesign, every glance like a carpenter's square laid against the city's bones. I found myself in the marketplace one afternoon, standing at a stall run by a woman from a village near my own. Her hands were stained dark from years of dyeing wool, and her voice had the same cadence as my mother's. She sold me a length of cloth for my sisters and, in the way of village people, asked after my family before the coins had even left my hand. Leaning close, she said, "They talk of tearing down half this market to make room for a broad avenue. A proper street for the king's carriages. They say, where will we go then?" I had no answer. Later that day, I passed one of the new schools Otto had ordered built. Through the open windows, I heard the voices of children reciting lessons, in Greek. It was a strange comfort, that sound. I thought of the days under Ottoman rule, when our language had been kept soft, tucked into the corners of kitchens, and whispered in church. Now it rang out in the open, crisp and unashamed. That night, at a cafeteria near the edge of the square, I listened to two men argue over coffee. One praised the king's new roads, the arrival of architects from Europe, the promise of order and progress. The other spat into the dirt and said, "We bled for this land, and now strangers are drawing lines on it, as if we were not here at all." Their words stayed with me as I walked back to my lodging. I could feel the city straining between pride and resentment, between the pull of its ancient roots and the pressure of the walls now being raised around them. From my window, I could see the Acropolis lit by the moon, the stones pale and still. Below it, Athens shifted and murmured, restless in its new skin. And I wondered if this was what freedom always felt like at first, not a clean break, but a long, uneasy negotiation between what had been and what was still to come. The next morning, I went back to the school. I told myself it was curiosity, but the truth is I wanted to hear those voices again, the sound of our language spoken without caution, strong enough to reach the street. The building itself was simple, whitewashed walls with a tiled roof still smelling of fresh clay. A small olive tree stood in the yard, its shadow stretching almost to the doorway. I waited outside until the teacher noticed me and stepped into the sunlight. He was younger than I expected, no more than 30, with a straight posture and eyes that seemed to take in more than they let on. When I told him I came from the coast, He smiled faintly. Then you've seen the old Greece, he said. Come, see the one we're trying to build. Inside, the room was bright, with benches crowded close together. Children of all ages sat there, some with bare feet, others in neatly mended shoes. Their clothes were a patchwork of colors and wear, but each one held a slate and a piece of chalk. On the far wall hung a map of the Peloponnese, the ink still sharp, the names written in Greek script. The teacher asked them to rise, and in unison they began reciting lines from Homer. The rhythm was steady, the words rolling like the sea. Sing, O muse, of the wrath of Achilles. I felt a strange tightening in my chest, hearing the old verses echo in a place so new. When the lesson turned to arithmetic, the teacher walked between the benches, correcting sums, nodding encouragement. At one point, a boy about 10 years old hesitated over a problem, and the teacher leaned down, speaking softly enough that I couldn't hear. The boy's face lit with understanding, and he went back to work. During the break, I stepped outside with the teacher. Children spilled into the yard, chasing one another around the olive tree. They come from everywhere, he told me. Some from the ruins of villages burned in the war. Some from the mountains, some from the islands. Their parents send them here because they believe, or hope, that learning will give them something the war could not take away. I asked him if the king supported the school. He hesitated before answering. Officially, yes. The crown funds the buildings, pays for books and chalk. But the spirit of what we teach, that belongs to us. We decide which stories they hear, which words they repeat. We teach them who they are, not just what the world wants them to be. His voice lowered, and his eyes flicked toward the road where two Bavarian soldiers were passing. We are free, Nikolas, but freedom is a tree that must be watered every day. If you forget, it withers, and you wake to find it gone. I left the school that afternoon with the sound of the children's recitations still in my ears. The city around me bustled with carts and construction, but in that small room I had seen something quieter, stronger, a kind of resistance that needed no muskets, only words and the will to keep them alive. That night, as I walked past the Acropolis under the stars, I thought of my father's warning years ago, when he'd placed a book in my hands and told me to remember every word. Back then, it had been an act of defiance. Now, in Athens, it was becoming the foundation of a new Greece. By the time my stay in Athens reached its second week, I had begun to feel the weight of something unsaid pressing on the city. It was there in the glances exchanged between market stalls when Bavarian officers passed, in the lowered voices of men drinking coffee, in the way conversations would change the moment a foreign uniform appeared. The changes the king had ordered were everywhere. Wide, straight streets were being cut through neighborhoods that had existed for centuries, their crooked lanes bulldozed into lines that pleased the eye of a European architect but severed the life of the communities that had lived there. Whole rows of houses were marked with chalk for demolition, some abandoned during the war, others still home to families who now had weeks to leave. One afternoon, I found myself in such a street. A crew of laborers was pulling down a stone wall while a foreman barked instructions in German. On the steps of the nearest house, an old woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed not on the rubble, but on the laundry she had hung that morning. Still swaying in the breeze, a young soldier approached her, speaking in halting Greek, pointing to the chalk mark on her door. She nodded once, slowly, and did not move. I turned away, but the image stayed with me. Later that evening, I went to the Cafino, where I had first overheard men debating the king's reforms. This time, the talk was sharper, the air thick with frustration. One man slammed his cup on the table, spilling coffee onto his coat. We did not fight for this, he said. We fought for a Greece ruled by Greeks. Instead, we bow to foreign advisors who draw lines on our land and call it progress. Across from him, another man raised his hands. Would you rather live as we did before, with the Turks counting every grain of wheat, every goat? Otto brings order. He brings Europe. And what does Europe bring? The first man shot back, streets we do not walk, buildings we do not enter, laws written in a language most of us cannot read. The argument swelled until the owner, a broad-shouldered man with a voice like gravel, told them to take it outside or drink in silence. They chose silence, but the heat of it remained, curling through the room like smoke. As I walked back to my lodging, I noticed the contrast more clearly than before. The new buildings, government halls, barracks, and grand houses for officials, stood with their clean lines and pale stone, gleaming in the moonlight. Around them, the older streets hunched in shadow, their plaster flaking, their windows shuttered. Athens was growing, but not evenly, and I could feel the strain in its bones, as if the city were being pulled into directions at once, one toward the future, as the king envisioned it, and one back toward the roots that had kept it alive through centuries of occupation. I didn't know then which way it would bend, but I could feel it, the same way you feel the air change before a storm. The quiet was too tight, the light too sharp, and somewhere, beyond the marble and the dust, thunder was gathering. The road back to the coast was longer than I remembered. Perhaps it was my legs, no longer driven by the urgency of war, or perhaps the years had stretched the distance in my mind. I followed the winding track down from the hills, through fields where wildflowers had begun to reclaim the soil, their colour spilling in waves of red and yellow. The air carried the faint brine of the sea long before I saw it. When the water finally appeared between the hills, it struck me like a memory made flesh, the wide blue arc of the Argolic Gulf, shimmering under the sun. For a moment, I simply stood there, the wind tugging at my coat, my throat tight. I had left this shore as a boy with ash in my hair and fear in my chest. Now I was a man, and the sea looked the same as it always had, indifferent to the years between us. The village was smaller than I remembered. Some houses were gone entirely, replaced by open plots where grass grew in uneven tufts. Others had been rebuilt with fresh plaster, their walls blindingly white in the mid-daylight. The church still stood, though its bell tower was newly painted, the cross atop it catching the sun like a shard of glass. People recognized me slowly. At first, it was cautious nods from men in doorways, women pausing at the well. Then faces began to soften, voices to call my name. Children I did not know tugged at their mothers' skirts and asked who I was, and the answers varied. A fisherman's son, a man from the hills, one of ours who came back. I went to the shore before I went anywhere else. My father's boat was gone, of course, claimed by fire or time. I could not tell. But other boats bobbed in the shallows, their paint peeling, nets drying in the sun. The smell of tar and saltwater wrapped around me, a scent that had been absent from my life for too long. An old fisherman I recognized, Spiros, who had taught me to tie my first proper knot, came to stand beside me. His beard was whiter now, his shoulders more bent, but his voice was the same. "You've been gone a long time, Nikolas," he said. "Long enough to see the world change," I answered. He spat into the sand. "The sea hasn't." We talked for a while, our words meandering like the tide. He told me the catches had been poor the last few seasons, that storms came earlier now and stayed longer. But he also spoke of weddings, of children born, of feasts held on the shore when the weather was kind. As the sun began to dip, I walked the length of the beach alone. The sand was cool under my feet, the waves folding in and out with a patience that no war could hurry. I realized then that I had not returned to the village I had left. That place existed only in my memory. What stood before me now was something different, a place remade, carrying both the scars and the quiet triumphs of survival. And perhaps that was enough. It didn't take long for the old rhythms to find me again. They were buried under years of marching and hiding, but they had never truly left. At dawn, the village stirred in a way that was different from the city's noise, softer, slower. Roosters crowed in an even competition. The first boats pushed off from the shore with the creak of oars, and the smell of bread drifted from ovens still warm from the night before. I would wait to the sound of gulls circling above the shallows and know, without looking, that the fishermen had begun to haul in their nets. I started helping Spyros on his boat. It wasn't my father's, but it felt close enough. The wood groaned under my feet as we pushed into the gulf, the air cool and damp before sunrise. The first mornings were humbling. My hands had lost the surety of their younger years. Rope that should have coiled neatly slipped from my fingers. Knots that once came without thought had to be untied and done again. Spyros said nothing, just gave me the line, and let me find the rhythm again. By the third week, the muscle memory had returned. In the afternoons, I would walk through the market. It wasn't large, a handful of stalls lined the square, selling whatever the season gave. Olives cured in brine, figs split open to show their ruby hearts, small wheels of goat cheese wrapped in cloth. The market was more than trade. It was the village's heart. News passed here faster than coin. Who had a child, who had lost a goat, whose cousin had come back from the city with stories of King Otto's court. It all flowed between the baskets of goods. Not everything was as it had been. Some faces were missing entirely, replaced by the children of those who hadn't returned. And there were newcomers, families from inland villages burned during the war, now trying to make a life by the sea. They carried with them different accents, different ways of doing things, but the village, in its own slow way, absorbed them. The evenings were my favorite. When the day's work was done, people would gather along the shore. Some mended nets, some played cards by the light of oil lamps, and the younger ones, myself among them, would sit in small groups, talking until the stars blurred into the black. There was laughter again, though it was not the unbroken laughter of childhood. It had edges, like a blade that had been sharpened too often. One night, an old neighbour, Kyria Eleni, stopped me as I passed her doorway. She handed me a small clay cup of sweet wine and said, "You walk as though you're still carrying a pack on your back." "Perhaps I am," I told her. She nodded knowingly. "The sea will take it from you, if you let it. But you have to give it up first." I thought about her words the next morning as Spyros and I pulled in the nets heavy with sardines, the sun warming the back of my neck. There was a strange comfort in the weight of the catch. It was a weight that promised life, not death. For the first time in years, I began to believe I might stay. I first saw her again on a market morning. The square was crowded, the air thick with the smell of olives and fresh bread, voices rising and falling like the tide. I had just traded a basket of sardines for a coil of rope when she stepped into view, carrying a tray of figs wrapped in vine leaves. Her hair was pinned back loosely, the way women do when they expect to be busy all day, and the sun caught the copper in it as she moved between stalls. Maria, before the war, we had been little more than acquaintances. She, the daughter of a mason, I, the fisherman's son. We'd crossed paths at the well, at feast days, at the edge of dances, where neither of us was brave enough to step forward. Then the soldiers came, the village emptied, and years passed without a word. I had not thought of her often during the fighting. Survival leaves little room for such luxuries. But seeing her there, standing in the light as though nothing could touch her, was like finding a piece of home I didn't know I'd lost. She saw me before I could look away. A smile, small but warm, touched her mouth. "Nikolas," she said, as though testing the sound of my name. "You're back." I managed. "And you." "I never left," she said simply. Though I thought often of those who did, we spoke for a while, standing in the space between her stall and mine, our conversation broken by customers and the passing noise of the square. She told me her father had died during the war, her brothers gone to work in Nafplio. She kept the household with her mother now, trading figs and vine leaves, tending a small garden behind their home. That afternoon, I found excuses to pass by her stall again, once for bread, once for a handful of herbs I didn't need. Each time, she greeted me without surprise, as if she'd known I would come. In the weeks that followed, we began to meet outside the market. Sometimes it was on the shore at sunset, where she would bring her sewing and I would mend a net. Other times, we walked the olive groves, the air heavy with the scent of fruit beginning to ripen. She spoke easily, her voice soft but certain, asking questions I didn't expect. What the hills looked like in winter, whether the mountains felt as lonely as they seemed from a distance, what I thought freedom meant now that the fighting was over. One evening, as we watched the last light fade over the gulf, she said, "The war taught us to live without what we love, peace. Peace is harder. It asks us to decide what we can't live without." I didn't answer then, but I knew what my answer would be. The village was still healing, its wounds not yet closed, but I began to feel something steady under my feet again. And in Maria's company, the weight I carried from the hills seemed lighter, as if the sea had finally begun to take it from me. It was late when the knock came. Too late for neighbors, too soft for troublemakers. The fire in my hearth had burned low, and I was sitting by it, running my fingers along the coarse twine of a net I'd been mending, when the sound came again. I opened the door to find Leonidas standing there, his coat dusty from the road, his eyes sharp despite the hour. He hadn't changed much since the war, still moving with the quiet urgency of a man who never let himself be truly still. "Can I come in?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. I stepped aside, and he crossed the threshold, his gaze sweeping the room as if taking stock. "It's been a long time since I've walked this far south," he said. "I thought you'd be done with all this," I replied. "The fighting's over. Over." He gave a short laugh that held no humor. "The Turks are gone, but the game's the same. There are still lines to be drawn, debts to be settled, and men who think freedom means taking what isn't theirs. I need someone I can trust to carry a message to Argos." Quietly, I felt the old pull in my chest, that sharp mix of purpose and danger I thought I'd left behind in the mountains. "Why me?" "Because you know how to vanish when you have to," he said simply. "And because the people who need this message trust me, and I trust you." I glanced toward the corner where my fishing gear leaned against the wall. The season was just turning, the sardines running thick. I had nets to mend, mornings on the water, and in the evenings. Maria. She had begun to take root in my days, without me even noticing. Her voice and her smile threaded through the rhythm of the shore. Leonidas seemed to read my hesitation. "It's one trip, Nikolas. You'll be back before the moon turns, but I won't lie. If you're caught, there's no friendly hand to pull you free this time." I thought of the hills, the narrow passes, the smell of powder. I thought of Maria's words, "Peace is harder. It asks us to decide what we can't live without." "Can it wait until morning?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, the road's safer in the dark, fewer eyes." I sat for a moment longer, the sound of the waves outside, the only thing between us. Then I rose, took my coat from its peg, and reached for my boots. "Let me write a note," I said. "For Maria?" he asked. I didn't answer. When I stepped out into the night beside him, the air was cool and sharp, the stars bright over the gulf. The village lay silent behind us, the sea breathing its steady rhythm, and I wondered if this would be the last time I saw it exactly as it was now. I came back to the village in the late autumn of my life, when the wind off the gulf had that sharper edge that makes you pull your coat tight even before the sun sets. The journey from Argos had been slow, my knees no longer quick on the hills, my steps measured not by urgency, but by how far I could go before the ache set in. From the ridge above the bay, I saw the water first, as I always had, but this time it did not strike me with the same urgency it once had, no rush of longing or the ache of absence. It was quieter, steadier. The sea was still blue, still endless, but I had lived long enough to know it cared nothing for the comings and goings of men. The village below looked both familiar and strange, like the face of an old friend changed by decades of weather. The square had been paved in stone, the church's bell tower stood taller now, its cross catching the lake light. New houses, painted bright, stood beside the old ones that had sagged into the earth. Children ran between them, their laughter unshadowed by the sounds of war. But there were absences too. Absences only someone who had left and returned could feel. The olive grove, where we had once hidden from the soldiers, was gone, replaced by a cluster of houses with red-tiled roofs. The path to the well had been widened into a proper street. And on the beach, where the fishermen once left their boats drawn high on the sand, a line of stone piers now reached into the water. I walked slowly through the market, nodding to faces that were new to me, but who greeted me with the polite warmth reserved for strangers who seemed somehow familiar. A few older villagers recognized me and called my name, though their voices carried a note of surprise, as if they'd never expected to see me again. Maria was not among them. I had known she would not be. Her house still stood near the edge of the square, but its door was painted blue now, and the garden behind it was wild with rosemary and lavender. I paused there for a long moment, my hand resting on the gate, before moving on. That evening, I walked to the shore. The air smelled of salt and wet rope, and the sound of the waves was the same as it had been on the night I left with Leonidas all those years ago. I stood there until the stars came out, listening. I thought of my father, of the book Petros had entrusted to me, of the flag I had first seen in the valley beyond the olive trees. I thought of the faces of those who had not returned, of Leonidas's quick, sure voice in the dark, of Maria's words, "Peace is harder." She had been right. Peace had not been a reward. It had been a task, a long one, and it was still unfinished. The tide came in, and I let it wash over my boots. Somewhere in the dark, a gull cried, and the sound carried farther than I expected. I closed my eyes and breathed the salt air deep, as if it might fill the empty spaces left inside me. I was home, but home, I had learnt, was not the same place you left. The cemetery lay on a rise at the edge of the village, where the land tilted toward the sea. From there, you could hear the waves even on still days, their constant breath a reminder that time moves in one direction only. I walked there the morning after my return. The path was narrow, flanked by cypress trees that reached straight into the pale sky. The air was heavy with their resinous scent, a smell I had known since boyhood, the smell of both shade and solemnity. The gate creaked when I pushed it open. Inside, the rows of graves were uneven, some marked by polished marble, others by simple stones with names that had faded into the grain. I moved slowly between them, reading what I could. The wall was written here in silence, years clustered together on the headstones, men who had been too young to die, women who had lived decades without their husbands. I found my father's grave near the far wall. My mother had joined him there years later, the two names side by side. I knelt, brushing the dust from the carved letters, tracing them with my fingers. My father had no great monument, only a stone worn smooth by seasons, but it was enough. I remembered his voice telling me to remember the words in Petros's book, to keep them safe no matter what. A little farther on, I came to the place I had been both seeking and dreading. The stone was small, modest, Maria, it read, with the year of her birth and the year she had gone. A sprig of rosemary grew beside it. Its scent sharp in the cool air. I stood there for a long time, my hands resting on the top of the stone. I thought of the market mornings, of the evenings by the sea, of her words about peace and what it demanded of us. I had left on a night when she was sleeping, a note folded beneath her door, thinking I would return to finish what had begun between us. But life, I learned, has a way of turning temporary choices into permanent losses. Nearby, I recognized other names, coasters, whose voice had held the hard truth of the hills. Leonidas, though his grave was only a marker, for his body had never been found. And Petros, the schoolteacher, who had lived long enough to see children reciting in Greek without fear. I moved among them like a man walking through the pages of a book he had once lived inside. Each stone a chapter, each name a voice I could still hear if I closed my eyes. When I left, the sea wind was stronger, carrying the sound of gulls over the hill. I paused at the gate and looked back once, the cypress trees swaying slightly. It struck me then that this place was more than a resting ground. It was a ledger, recording not just the cost of our freedom, but the shape of the lives we had built from it. And I wondered how long it would be before someone else walked these paths, reading my name in the stone. The village was quiet when I walked back from the cemetery, the kind of quiet that settles in after the day's work is done. The sun was low, laying its gold across the rooftops, and from somewhere near the shore came the faint clink of oars against a boat's hull. I sat outside my small house, not the one I'd been born in, but a modest place given to me by a cousin who had moved inland. From there, I could see the gulf, the water shifting with the wind, each ripple catching the light for a moment before vanishing. It struck me how different Greece was now, and how much it was the same. We had no Ottoman banners, no tax collectors with ledgers, no soldiers who made us lower our voices in our own homes. Children learned to read in Greek, and their laughter carried freely through the streets. The bells of the church rang without hesitation, and no one paused to see if they rang too loudly. Yet the peace we had bled for was not without its cracks. In Athens, I'd seen men argue over the king's reforms, over the influence of foreigners, over whether the path to the future required us to cut away too much of our past. I'd walked streets where grand houses cast long shadows over crumbling ones, where progress seemed to belong to some and not to others. Freedom, I had learned, was not a single battle won. It was a series of choices, made every day, to hold on to the things that mattered, and to let go of the rest, and sometimes we made the wrong choices. As the evening deepened, I thought of those who had not lived to see this imperfect Greece, my father, Maria, Kostas, Leonidas. Would they recognize the country we had now? Would they call it worth the cost? I believe they would, not because it was perfect. It never would be. But because it was ours. Because we could argue in the open. Because we could teach our children the names of our heroes without fear. Because the sea belonged to us again, and the wind that filled the sails was not weighed down by someone else's flag. The first stars began to appear, and I found myself speaking aloud, though no one was there to hear. "This is the Greece we kept," I said softly. Not the one we dreamed of, but the one we could build. And as the night settled over the village, I felt something I had not felt in many years. Not triumph, not sorrow, but a kind of steady peace, like the tide turning quietly in the dark. The days grew shorter, and the wind from the Gulf carried the smell of winter. I found myself rising earlier, as though I might catch the sun before it slipped away, walking the shore in the grey-blue light before the village stirred. The sand was cold under my boots, the waves breaking in their endless, patient rhythm. I had begun to keep a small fire each evening, not just for warmth, but for the comfort of watching its steady glow. There was a kind of companionship in the flames. They asked nothing, expected nothing, only gave what they could until they burned out. One night, as I sat by the fire, I took out the old book Petros had given me decades ago, the one I had carried through war and exile. The leather was cracked now, the pages yellowed, but the words inside were as sharp as they had been when I first traced them with my fingers as a boy. I read them aloud, my voice low, letting the sound fill the small room. It felt less like recitation and more like returning something to the air that had been too long kept inside. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the pier. The fishermen were already at work, their voices carrying over the water, but I stayed apart from them. From there, I could see the line where the sea met the sky, that faint shimmer where the world seemed to end. I thought of the roads I had walked, the mountain passes, the burning villages, the markets of Athens. I thought of the people whose faces still lived in my mind, though their bodies had long since turned to earth. I thought of the choice Maria had named all those years ago, what we can't live without, and how my answer had changed with time. When the sun finally lifted over the horizon, it was thin but steady, painting the water in streaks of gold. I stood there until it was high enough to warm my face, and I realized that this, more than any battle or victory, was what we had fought for, the right to stand in our own land, under our own sky, and feel the day begin. I turned back toward the village, the sound of the gulls overhead, the salt in the air, the weight of years both heavy and light on my shoulders. One day, someone else would walk these streets and remember me, or not. My name might be read from a stone, or it might fade with the passing of the last person who knew it. But the sea would remain, the hills would remain, and Greece, flawed, stubborn, and unyielding, would remain, and that was enough.